We're going to learn how to visually design and code a React app that lets us create and manage all of our React components inside of a visual IDE along with all the styles and state. Hey team, I'm Colby Fayok. And if this is your first time here, make sure you hit subscribe and click that little notification bell for future web dev content. This video is brought to you and sponsored by Codux. As we'll see in this tutorial, Codux is a visual IDE that gives us a way to visually edit, manage, and add components to our React application. It gives us an easy way to have full control over the experiences that we're building so that we can actually work with our components inside the application rather than constantly having to go back and forth between our editor and our browser. We're about to dig in, but head on over to spacejelly.dev/Codux where you can download the free beta version and we can get an idea of all the features available. So to see how this works, we're going to build a contact form where we're going to build this entire UI using Codux. Once we have all the UI built, we're going to wire it up and deploy it to Netlify where we're going to use Netlify serverless functions to send an email using SendGrid. So to get started, we first need to download Codux, and remember you can head over to spacejelly.dev/Codux or just go to codux.com where we can click this download button where we're going to find all the different options depending on what system we're on. Once you open up Codux, you'll be prompted to log in where you can create an account using whatever service you want, whether that's just with an email, but I'm going to use Google and I'm just going to log in with that. But once we're logged in, we can see we have a few different options, including loading a new project, a tutorial project, and we can even go to this menu where we can see we have options like adding a local project or even from GitHub, though those are currently experimental. But we're going to go ahead and just create a new project. Here you can really name the project whatever you want. I'm going to name mine My Contact Form, and we can see that we can save it to wherever we want, where I use my code directory, so I'm going to keep it there. But we can also choose our styling solution where we currently have the ability to do SCSS, or we can do stylable where I'm going to keep it with SCSS and go ahead and click create. From here, Codux is going to bootstrap our project where the first thing we need to do is run install. And you can think of this like running npm install or yarn install inside of a new project where it's going to run all the scripts and get everything ready to go. Once it's finished, we can click close, where we'll now be presented with the Codux dashboard where we'll notice a few things. First of all, we have boards and we have components, where the way that we're going to be building this is we have different components. And for each component, we can create different boards. If you're familiar with the concept of Storybook, it's kind of similar where if we have components in Storybook, each of those components can have the different stories. But at this point, all we have is our basic application. And if we select this to dig in, we'll notice that we just bootstrapped a new Create React application where we can look around, we can see the different canvas boards. Now this is just our starting point, but this is going to give us the ability to begin creating our new application from scratch. Now to actually dig in to start editing this application and see the code, we can double click on the app here or select the edit button where we can actually see where we can start breaking down all the different elements that are on the page. Now, before we dig in too far, the thing that's even cooler about this is we really just bootstrapped a new Create React application. And that means it's really just a code project behind the scenes. And everything we're going to do here is actually modifying the code, not doing something hacky that does it on the side. We're actually making code changes with this. We can see exactly what I mean by navigating into that new project wherever we created it, where we can run npm run start just like we would any other Create React app. Where as soon as that loads in the browser, we'll see our new Create React app. And just to kind of prove that this works, anytime we make a change, if we keep our dev server open, it's going to reflect that change right away. Now, to get started, we're going to clear out this application anyways so that we can begin creating our own stuff. So I'm going to go ahead and get rid of this header, which will remove all that inner code by selecting this little drop down here and clicking delete element. Now that'll delete it inside of my Codux app. But if we head to the browser, it should refresh and we should now see that it's blank, just like inside of Codux. But now let's actually get started adding elements to our application. So if I go to this add button up here and click it, we can see that I have a bunch of things available to us, and I can even look through all the menus, but we know that we want to add a form. Now, if I search for form up here, we can see that I have two options where I have this form, which is kind of like a template that I can use, or I can just add a raw form. So for now, I'm going to just add the raw form and I'm going to drag it over, and we can see that it now created that form. But a form is pretty much empty by nature as it's meant to wrap our inputs. So let's actually add those inputs. So I'm going to click add again, and I'm going to search for input itself where we can, same thing where we can add our little template inputs, but I'm going to drag in the raw input where now, as soon as that pops up, we can start to see that we're actually building out that UI. Now we want to also make sure that we have a label for our input. So I'm going to search for a label as well. And similarly, I'm going to drag that into my application. And we can see that we now have a label, but all we need to do now is actually add some text for that label. Now, if you think about how the code works, you actually put text inside of the label in terms of how React thinks. So I'm going to go up to add here and I'm going to search for text where we can see this raw text element. I'm going to drag this into my label, into the field, and then drag it as a child into label, where now we see that text, and on the right, we can see that we can modify the properties of that, where let's call this name, as the first one we want to get is capturing somebody's name, so we want the name text in that label. So now at this point, we can see that we have our label and our input, and to make it a little bit easier to see like it would be inside of an application, we can actually come up to this little menu here and click the eye icon where we can preview it, and we can see that I can type inside of this when I can add my name, and that's what it's going to look like when it's actually on a page. But for now, we want to keep editing so we can have the select option. Now in a second, we'll learn how to customize this to be exactly how we want, but before we get too far, in order to encapsulate some of the different things that we want to add to this, we want to create a component out of that. Now this is kind of the bread and butter of this application where we can manage all of our components. So let's learn how to make both an input component and a label component. So I'm going to head back to the home of the dashboard using this little home icon, where we can now see that we have our boards, the board updated to reflect my existing application, but I want to create a new component. So I'm going to head over to this new component button, and we can see that we get a few options for how we actually create this. Now I want this to just be an input. So I'm going to specify input with a capital I. We can even see that it gives us a default board name. We even get some templates available to us that we can create so that when we're creating new components, we can adhere to that template. But for now, we don't have that available, so we're going to just keep it as default. And we can even get some advanced options if we want to really customize how we're going to create our components inside of our application. But for now, I'm going to leave this as is, going to go ahead and click create, where we're going to drop into our new component. We can see how it's going to look like inside of this canvas where it's going to give us the preview, but we want to double click and go inside of this input where we want to start actually adding an input into this. So the first thing I'm going to do is remove the text, as we don't want to have any text for our input, but then we're going to add back that input element. So I'm going to drag that into the root. And at this point, we now simply have a new component where we can even go back to the home and we see that it now is getting listed in our components section. We can even see the board here where it shows that input component as a preview. Now let's add that into our application. So like before, I'm going to click into my app board where we can see all of our elements again. And let's go ahead and first add our new component, where if I search for input, we're going to see, just like we saw before, our local component, which is the one we created. Now, alternatively, we could have selected local components over here, which will only show our components. Even if we don't actually search, we'll be able to see what all we have available. But I'm going to drag in this input into my application, where now we can see that we have two inputs here. We have the one that we just created as a component, but we also have the original one that we created. So let's go ahead and remove that original raw input. And now we can do the exact same thing with our label. So like before, I'm going to create a new component. I'm going to call that label. I'm going to actually dig into the code. But now we know that we want to actually use text for our label, but that text is going to be dynamically added using children instead of an actual text node, because we want to have the ability to pass that in from outside of the component instead of having something prefixed. So I'm still going to delete that element, but now I'm going to go up to add, and I'm going to add my label as the raw element. But as you might notice, we can't actually see anything here, and that's because the label doesn't currently have any values. Now, what we want to do is give the label the ability to accept children so that it can actually render it on the screen. So this is going to be where the code view comes in. And if I look down at the bottom here, I can see I have this code tab. And if I click that and open it, we can first see that this is going to be the default view for our board. Now, just as a quick note, remember I was talking about the idea of having components versus boards? For all of our components, we could create multiple boards where we can render different experiences depending on how we want to visualize it for that particular state. Now we're going to modify that board code in a second so we can actually preview this. But for now, I want to actually modify the code and add that children prop for my label. So up on this label itself, I'm going to click that drop down where I'm going to click view code. where now we can see all the code that's being used to create our label component. Now we want to do two things here. We want to first add a children prop so that we can actually use it inside of the component, but then we want to pass it in as a value nested inside of that label. Now, when we're passing children in as a prop, to make sure that we have the right types on this, it gets a little bit verbose. So I'm going to first specify children, where I'm going to say that I want to be able to pass in a JSX.element, and we can even see that Codux is giving us this autocomplete so that we can easily add this to our application. But I also want to be able to add an array of our JSX.element, but we also want to simply be able to pass in a string. So I'm going to add the or here, where I'm going to say string, and then finally an or on the whole original statement, where I'm going to pass in a string for that as well, and finally close that off. Next, I want to actually add it as a prop for the component function. So I'm going to add my children there, and then I want to actually add it on the label. So I'm going to add this as a new open label component, where then I can go ahead and pass in my children. Now again, we still can't see anything because we haven't actually passed in any children, but let's add that to our board so that we can see what that looks like. So now let's actually click back on that label board that we saw earlier, and instead of just passing in that label like that, I'm going to go ahead and open up that label so then I can pass in my label as an example here if I spell it right. And now we have a nice preview so that we can see what it looks like when we're modifying our label. So now let's actually add this into our application. So I'm going to head back over to the app tab. I'm going to go up to add, where I'm going to look for my label, and I'm going to drag that into my application, where now we still want to use this text node in order to actually add it as the label, because now we want to accept that children. So I'm going to just move this up onto our new label, where we can see that it's now specified as a child, and we can still see that we can modify that property where we can change what the actual text is. But now we no longer need that original label, so I'm going to go ahead and delete that. Now this is looking good. I'm going to jump ahead and add a few more inputs here, where I went ahead and added an email and a message input. Now something that we need to additionally do for all these different inputs is be able to add the name for each of these inputs. And further, we want to make sure that we can link the label to the field so that when you click on that label, it's actually going to open up the text editor for that specific input. So to do that, we again need to go to our props, where let's start with our input. So I'm going to head over to the input. And like we learned before, I can now hover over this. I can click view code, where I now have access to those inputs. Now I want to add two things to this. First, I want to add an ID, which is going to be a string. And I'm going to also add a name, which again is going to be a string. I want to then make those both available as props, and then finally add them to the actual element. So I'm going to say ID of ID and name of name. And now if we head back over to our app and select an input, we can now see that we have those new properties available to us under the properties panel when we select that element. So for my name, I'm going to say that I want an ID of name and a name of, well, name. Additionally, I want to make sure that I have my ID and name for email and for my message. As far as the label is concerned, we want to use the HTML4. So I'm going to add an HTML4 prop, which is going to be a string as well. I'm going to pass that in as a prop, HTML4. And then finally, I'm going to add that to the label HTML4, where this is going to be the ID that we add for each of those inputs. And once I fill out those new properties, just like I did before, I can head over to the preview like we noticed, where now I can see that if I click on the name, I get that name input or the email or the message, so we can now see that it's working. Now finally, for our form, we need one last thing, and that's actually the ability to submit the form. So we need a submit button. So I'll create my new submit button component, where I've gone ahead and skipped ahead, where I added my button just like my label, added text underneath, where I was able to use children to add that into the button. Where now I'm going to go ahead and search for that submit button, and I'm going to drop it into my form just like I did before, where after updating the text, we can now see that we have our form. At this point, we can now take a second where we can load up our React application in our browser, and we can see exactly that, where we do see our form. We can even run git diff and see exactly what's happening to our application with all the code that's added and managed that's happening from inside of Codux. But for now, let's keep going, where next I want to publish this to the web. So that includes two things for me. I'm going to first publish this to a new GitHub repository, but I'm also going to then take that GitHub repository and deploy it using Netlify. Now, if we look at the top right bar here, we can see that these are all related to how we actually do this, where we can see the commits that we can actually see the changes that are going to occur, as well as actually syncing that up and publishing it. Now, we don't currently have a GitHub repository synced up, so I'm going to go ahead and click sync, where because I haven't logged in before, I need to now log into my GitHub account, where Codux is going to pop open a new tab in my browser that's going to allow me to log in with GitHub so that I can actually authenticate with Codux to work with my account. Now you can see all the different data that it's requesting. I'm going to go ahead, I don't want to give any organization access, so I'm going to just simply authorize Wix. Where now we can see that we can create a new GitHub repository, where I'm going to select Colby Fayok, which is the owner. I'm going to keep the project name as my repository name. I can make it either public or private. I'm going to go ahead and just make it public, and then I'm going to click create. Now it says that our project is synced, and we can even see the new address to our GitHub project. So let's see what that looks like. I'm going to click copy. And if we open that up, we can see our brand new project inside of GitHub. Now, if we look back inside of our project though, we can see that we still have 10 changes that are not synced. So let's go ahead and click commit. I'm going to enter a commit message, such as creating a new form. I'm going to click commit again. And now I'm going to click sync so that I can actually push that up to GitHub. Once we refresh, we can now see that commit is actually added onto our project, where we can see all the creating a new form changes. But now let's deploy this to Netlify, where if you head over to Netlify and log into your account, we'll see that I actually have a bunch of projects already, but we want to add a new site. So I'm going to click this add new site button, where I'm going to import an existing project, where I'm going to go ahead and click GitHub, since that's where we actually put our project. And then I'm going to search for that new repository of my contact form, where once my repositories load, I'm going to go ahead and select that, where we can see that Netlify gives us our build options. And the cool thing is it already detects that we're using create React app. So I'm going to leave everything as is, and I'm going to simply click deploy site. At this point, Netlify will take our project from GitHub, it'll build it on its own servers, it'll take that output and it'll upload it so that we can have our site available. Now we can see that we have a randomized site name for this, but we can go to domain settings if we want and change it to a different subdomain when we're previewing our site. But once we see the green publish and it's done, we can now click that open into a new tab. And now we can see our new contact form that's simply deployed out to the web. So next, let's actually add some styles to make this look a little bit better and a little bit more usable. To start, I'm going to head back over to my input component, where if we start to look at this and I select this input element, we can see that we have a few panels over here where we already saw the properties for actually creating the different attributes for our input. But let's head over to the styles tab, where it's going to be this little drop here, where we can see that we don't have any classes on here. But what we want to do is create a new selector so we can apply some styles. So I'm going to go ahead and click create or apply a class. I'm going to then click create class, and let's just call this input. I'm going to go ahead and click create, where if we were looking closely, we can even see that Codux went ahead and added that as a class name because we're using CSS modules in order to achieve that. But now if we look over in our styles bar, we can see that we now have this visual editor for being able to do everything that we want to style our input and make it look good. So to start, let's actually add some padding to this. So I'm going to navigate down to padding, and I'm going to go ahead and click the preview button so I can add some text in there. And let's say space jelly, where I want to add some padding. I want to use M's for my actual padding. So I'm going to switch that to M, and let's start off with 0.6, where it's going to add all those different values. We can see that this reset and I lost my value. So let's add that again. It's looking pretty good, but I like to add a little extras on the sides. So I'm going to head back over to padding, and we can see that when we updated that to 0.6, it updated all of them because by default, all of them are linked. So I can go ahead and click this link here so that it unlinks everything, where now I can change the right to 0.8 as well as the left to 0.8. And depending on the different way that you prefer on adding values, you have all these different values in here, such as pix, percentage, rem, viewport width, viewport height. It supports everything you need so that you can do it just how you like, but I prefer the M, so I'm going to keep this in here. And again, we can see now that's looking really good. Next, let's actually change the border up a little bit, where depending on the browser that we're actually looking at, it might look ever so slightly different. So we can make that consistent no matter where we're at. So I'm going to scroll all the way down until we reach border, and let's make the pixel or the border width just 1 pixel. But let's say I want to change the color. I'm going to go ahead and paste this value in, but I'm going to make it a medium gray, and you can use this picker here, or you can use it just like you want. And additionally, an advanced feature, you can actually use CSS variables inside of this. So this is something that you can actually pick if you set them up for your application. But for now, I'm just going to use this medium gray, and I'm going to go ahead and scroll down a little bit, where I'm going to also check or change the corners. And just like before, I want to use M, where I'm going to say I want this to be 0.2 EM, so I can have my nice rounded corners. Now, similar to having those borders generally consistent, I want to select this input and have that highlight the same color no matter where I'm at. So I'm going to also update that. Now, to do that, we need to change the focus color. If we look back over inside of our styles panel, we can see that we have this states section, where if I click this little icon here, we can see that we can select our element state, and including focus, where if I select that, I now have the ability to create a new selector for input focus. So I'm going to go ahead and click that. And now we can see under my list of selectors that I'm now currently modifying my input focus selector. But now I want to make the changes to that. So how about first of all, we change the color, where I'm going to go ahead and make this a nice blue. And one thing I'm additionally going to do is if I scroll down, I'm going to unset my outline, because I'm going to manually create that focus state. And I don't want that outline to actually interact or interfere with it. So if I click into this, we can see that it still shows that orange, but I want it to show that blue, which I'm manually setting up. Now, usually I wouldn't recommend turning off the outline, as it's there for accessibility state, but we're doing this manually and recreating it ourselves, so we're okay with that. But if we come over here and actually click into outline, we can see that we have a few options. Now I can put in the value that I want, but I'm going to go ahead and click unset so that it removes that default setting. And now if I click into it, we can see that it's still showing that actual state for the focus. But now to actually see that that's working properly, we're currently forcing our focus state. So let's first remove that forced state so that we can get back to our original, where now we can see that if we click on and off, we're going to get that highlight whenever we select that input. We can even take that a step further by adding a shadow, so that makes it even more obvious. So if we scroll down to effects and select shadows, I'm going to select add a shadow, where we're going to get this little dialog where let's first select the color. I'm going to still make it that blue, where then I can continue editing that shadow. I'm just going to make it 0 degrees, where I'm going to remove the distance so that it's actually going to not come off the input. But you can configure this to how you want. But then I'm going to add the blur up a little bit to 6 so that we can see that it's nice and smooth outside of that input. But when we click on and off of it, it's going to show us that effect. We can even see what this looks like inside of our browser, where if we click into one of our inputs, we get that nice blue effect to show that it's an active or focused input. Next, I want to make sure that all my labels are nice and anchored to the left, and that they're actually going to give a little bit of spacing between the input and the label itself. So similarly, what we did to the input, I'm going to head over to my label. I'm going to add a new class for my label, where let's make sure this is displayed as block. I'm going to scroll down and see what else. I'm going to make sure that I set this as a width of 100%, so it expands the entire container that it's in. And finally, I'm going to make sure that it is left aligned. I can go ahead and change this to whatever I want it to be, but I do want it to be left aligned. But also we can play around with the font size. Maybe I want it to be slightly smaller, so I can make it 0.8 EM. And how about I want to make it a little bit thicker so that it's a little bit nicer to look at, but it's still going to be nice and clear as to what it actually is. And finally, like I mentioned before, I want to add a little bit of margin so it separates itself from the label. So to do that, I'm going to first unlink all of my different options. I'm going to go ahead and select that as M, and let's add that as 0.5 EM. If I now look back at my application, I think that's looking a lot better, but I think I can make a few more tweaks. What I'm additionally going to do is I'm going to add a new component called a form row that's going to wrap both my label and my input. So it's going to take in children just like I did with my label, but it's going to allow me to add some styling between each of those labels and the input. Now I'm going to do that and jump ahead, but try to see if you can do that on your own. But we can now see that I have these form rows where it's doing just that. It's adding some additional spacing between those, and it's just giving us a visual way to group those labels and the inputs. I also want to make sure that our submit button looks a little bit better. So once I'm inside of my button, I'm going to go to the styles. I'm going to select my button, and just like before, I'm going to create my class, but then I'm going to go through and create all the tweaks that I want. And we can see that our form is looking much better. Now from here, I'm going to just add some more styles to my form. I'm even going to add some text, such as how about I'm going to add an H1 where I can actually add a title to my form. But once we get to a point where we're happy with it, we can see that I'm noticing one other thing, and the spacing's a little bit wonky, but that's because by default, it doesn't use border box, which personally I prefer to use. So for this, we'll need to break into our code editor, which if we look at the tabs on the bottom left, I can actually use the files where I can edit just like I would inside of my IDE. So I'm going to select source, and I'm going to go to index.css, where inside all I'm going to do is put a star, and I'm going to say box sizing border box. But now when we come back to the application, we can see that those changes were actually set in and things are looking really great, and I'm happy about the progress for my contact form. So now I can go ahead and commit these changes like I did before and say styling my new form. I can click commit. I can also push these out. And the cool thing with Netlify is we'll actually be able to see that Netlify sees this new commit and it's already going to kick off a new build since we pushed it to the main branch. So once that's done, I can now open it up in a new tab like I did before, and we can see all of our changes are now live on our site. Now, just as a quick note, if you prefer to work on a branch, Codux does have full capabilities to support working on and creating new branches. So if you prefer to do that, you can do that as well. Now, before we jump to actually wiring this thing up, let's do one more thing where I like to have little icons as part of my UI. So let's add a little send icon next to the submit inside of the button. To do this, I like to use React icons, and not only can we import the elements that come with it or our local components, we can also bring in third-party modules that we install into our project, just like we would if we were developing out of our traditional IDE. So I'm going to use React icons, which is one of my favorite tools for adding SVG icons into a project. Where to start, I'm going to go ahead and paste that installation where I'm going to npm install React icons. Where in order to actually take advantage of this, I need to create a new config file in my project called Codux external components. And inside there is where I'm going to list the components that I actually want to pull in. So like we did earlier, I'm going to head back to the code editor where I'm going to create a new file, and I'm going to call it that Codux external components.json. Here, I'm going to just copy the example that they have here, where I'll include this link inside of the description. Where once I paste it in, ultimately what I'm going to do is define the component package that I want to import and the components that are inside. So I'm going to rename this first of all to React icons, where we can look around for whatever icon we want to use, but I want to use RI send plain fill. So I'm going to copy that name. And what I want to do here is update the export name. I want to also update the name of it itself, and I'm just going to use the actual component name. I'm going to get rid of the second instance, but I'm going to also need to update the file path for this. Now, when importing these components from our actual React icons package, we're going to do so from the actual provider of that icon. So such as Font Awesome, you would go to FA. So I'm going to specify React icon/RI, which is going to allow me to pull this send plain fill from RI. And now before we can actually go ahead and add this, we need to just restart our project. So I'm going to click the C at the top here to return to the Codux dashboard, and then navigate right back into my project, where now I want to add that icon. So I'm going to head back into my app, where once inside, I'm going to go back into my app. But now if I go back down to my submit button, I want to add the icon right inside there. So I'm going to hit this menu here, where now we can see that I actually have that React icons available in my sidebar components here. So I'm going to go find that RI send plain fill, and I'm going to drag it right into the children of that button, where we'll see that icon pop right in there, where now I can just do what I did before and I can start to tweak the styles of that. So I'm going to go to my styles, I'm going to create a new class, and let's just call this icon send for now, where it's going to go ahead and create that class for me. And for now, while we can probably mess with the alignment a little bit, all I'm going to do is add a little bit of right margin to that. And let's say I want to use M, and let's use 0.5. And I think that's looking pretty good for our purposes. But the nice thing is, whether we want to add the icon like this or really any other library of components, we can easily add it so we can use it right in our project just like any of the other components. But now our form is looking pretty good, so let's wire this thing up. Now, while we could probably technically use the Codux file editor in order to do this, I'm going to head back over to VS Code where I'm going to be a little bit more comfortable with actually using the code. So diving into the app.tsx file, the first thing I want to do is actually capture the form data. Now to do that, I can add a submit handler right on the form. So I'm going to say on submit, where I'm going to have it run a function. Let's call it handle on submit, where I'm going to now take that function name and create it so that anytime this form gets submitted, it's going to fire this function. Now, when it does get fired, it's going to pass in an argument of event, where we want to say as soon as it gets fired, event.prevent default, which is going to prevent the default behavior of the form where it would submit to the page and actually try to process that. But we're going to do it client side, and we're going to write our own JavaScript to actually happen when the form gets submitted. Now, because we are working in a TypeScript project, we're going to have to keep in mind that we're going to have to write the types for everything. Now, I'm not necessarily a TypeScript guru here, so I'm going to paste in some of these different types, but you can easily follow along with me, and I'll have the code inside of the description as well. So starting with this event, I'm going to paste in the type, which is going to be React synthetic event, where it's going to pass in an HTML form element, which we'll ultimately want to get. Now we can see what that looks like by running console.log events so that we can see our event. And if we try to submit this form, we can see that it passes in that event along with all the information about it. So now we want to capture this information so that we can ultimately send it to a request. Now on this event is also something called current target, which is going to be our form, as that form is going to be our current target. Now inside of that, when you have a form selected, you can get something called the elements, which is going to be all the inputs that are related to that current form. Now this comes in a node collection, not an array. So what we're going to do is we're going to wrap this in array.from, which is going to say we're going to now have an array that includes references to all the inputs that are inside of our form. So what I'm going to do is on that, I'm going to say for each field, I'm going to run some functionality where I want to create a new constant of form data so that I can save all of my information. Now inside of this for each statement, I'm going to say form data, where I'm going to use my field.name, where that's going to be the name of the field or the input such as email or message. And I'm going to set that equal to my field.value. So in the instance of email, I'm going to use that key of email on the object. I'm going to pass it the values such as an email address that somebody will fill out. Now, the only thing that I want to keep in mind is not all of my fields actually have a name, particularly the submit button that doesn't have a name associated with it. So we're going to get a blank field if we try to run it on that. So the only other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to say if the field doesn't have a name, I'm just going to return and skip that. Now to get rid of these TypeScript errors, we have two things that we need to do. First of all, this form data needs to be a record. So I'm going to say I want this type to be record, where inside I'm going to be giving a string with a string of a key. Now, hopefully I use the right names, as I'm not a TypeScript expert, as I mentioned before, but ultimately that's going to help us actually validate that the form data is being used properly for our types. But the other thing is all the elements on our form, or rather what could be on a form, we might not necessarily all have inputs that could have a name on it. So what we want to do is we want to also filter out and add that as a rule so that it can make sure that we do have valid form data through the whole TypeScript process. Now again, I'm going to paste this in. I was lucky to have somebody from the Codux team help me out with this part of the TypeScript information, but this is going to be able to run on our function in a filter statement and make sure that we're indeed filtering it out the way that we need in order to validate that everything has a name. So I'm going to run a filter function on this before our for each statement, where I'm going to pass in that function. Now we can see that everything is being validated, that it's going to have a name and a value, indeed what we need, and it's going to ultimately build that form data object with all of our data. So now let's test that out. I'm going to update this console log statement to use that form data. And remember, all this code is going to be on a link inside of the description of this video. So if you want to follow along with this function statement, definitely open that up to see what's inside. But now when I submit my form, we can see that form data object along with all the data inside. So now that we're capturing the data, let's actually send it somewhere. And to do that, we're going to use Netlify Functions. Netlify Functions are essentially going to give us a serverless function that we can hit using an API endpoint, where really all we need to do is include it in a specific folder that we can also customize and then deploy it, and then it'll be available for us to use. Now, to work with this locally, because we don't want to only test in production, we want to install the Netlify CLI, which is going to give us the ability to easily play with this locally. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this npm install command. We're inside of my terminal. I'm going to paste that in, which is going to install this Netlify CLI package globally for me. For once it's done, we can run netlify -h, which will just let us know what options we have available with the CLI, but ultimately we want to run netlify login, which is going to allow us to log in with our Netlify account. Netlify will open a new tab in our browser where we can actually authorize this session. So I'm just going to go ahead and click authorize, where now we'll be able to see that we're logged in successfully. So now what we need to do is actually link our project. So I'm going to run netlify link, which is going to ask me how I want to link my project to Netlify. Now, the easiest way, in my opinion, to do this is to use the remote origin, which is how we're actually connecting it to GitHub. Since we use the GitHub account or project rather to connect to Netlify, it can see that and connect the site. So all we're going to do is hit enter when it's selected with use current git remote origin. And we might or might not have to confirm depending on if you have different projects connected to that account. But ultimately, once you select that site, we can see that we're now linked and we're going to be able to get started working with this project locally. Now, instead of spinning up the dev server that we typically do, we're going to use Netlify's CLI because that's also going to pull in our server, which is going to host the serverless functions as our endpoint. So we're going to run Netlify dev this time, which will actually use a new port for serving our application because it does so in a way that it's going to both load our React application and the Netlify server. So we can see that it's going to be ready on port 888, where it's going to automatically open that up for us in our browser, but we can see the application looks the same as it did before. So now let's add our serverless function. If we head back inside of our project, we're going to configure with Netlify where we want our functions to be served for. So under the root of the project, I'm going to create a new folder called Functions, which is where we're going to store our functions. And then I'm going to also create that configuration file. So I'm going to create a new file in the root, and I'm going to call it netlify.toml, where we're going to first specify our bracket of functions at the top, which is going to be our function specific configuration, where inside I'm going to give 2 spaces. I'm going to say my directory is going to be equal to functions or wherever you prefer to save that under. Now, ultimately, we want to create that new function. So under the functions directory, I'm going to create a new file called mail.tsx. Where here, I'm going to paste in some boilerplate code, which includes an export of handler, which is an async function. It includes 2 arguments, event and context, which has information about the request that's being made. But then ultimately, we're going to return a status code of 200, aka success, as well as a body that just includes a stringified message of success. Now, before we go any further, make sure you restart your development server so that Netlify picks up that new function that we added. But once the application reloads, while our application itself isn't going to look too different, we can see how we can access that new serverless function, where I'm going to copy this host, I'm going to paste in a new tab, and we're going to go to .netlify/functions/mail, which is going to be the address for how we actually invoke that function. Now, that's going to be different depending on where you deploy it, but ultimately it'll always be at .netlify functions and then the function name. But in the future, we're going to be posting data to this endpoint, so we're not always going to be able to open it up inside of the browser like this. But since it's just simply returning a message at this point, we can see that we can preview it right inside of the browser. So now let's actually invoke this function from the application and post our data. So back inside of source app.tsx, inside of this function, the first thing we want to do is make sure that this is an asynchronous function, as ultimately we want to be able to post data to it. And I personally like to use async await. Technically, if you want, you can just use a standard function and use .then to chain on, but I prefer that async await syntax, so I'm going to use that. But after we have all this data, we're ultimately going to want to use the fetch method in order to post it to our mail endpoint. So I'm going to run await fetch, where I'm going to post this to /netlify/functions/mail, which is going to be our endpoint. I'm going to add a second argument, which is going to include our options, including a method of post. And then I'm going to also include a body where I'm going to say json.stringify, where I'm going to just pass right along that form data. But now let's actually properly receive that data. So over back in mail.tsx, we're going to be able to get that data inside of event.body, but that's going to come in as a string. So what we want to do is say constant body is equal to json.parse, where we're going to grab that event body and actually turn it into a workable JavaScript object. Now, before we move along, let's actually test to see that this is working. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to first console log this out so we can see where that logs, but we can just replace this message of success with that body just so that we can see the response and see how that's working. Now, if I click that submit button, we're going to see that request made to that mail endpoint. And if we start to look at it and inspect it, we can see a preview of that response, which is going to be all of that data. And that came back from that serverless function. But if I look inside of my terminal, I can also see that that was logged out using that console log that we added. So we can see that we're definitely receiving that information. So now we just got to do something with it. Now, in order to send the mail, we're going to use SendGrid, and particularly going to use the mail package, where just as a quick heads up, we're not going to actually go through the entire SendGrid setup process for this. We're only going to implement the SDK and how to do that. So just as a quick note, if you do want to learn how to do things like set up your custom domain, check out my other video, which I'll link to above, which will go through that entire process. But again, we're just going to work through the SDK so we can quickly see how we can set this up inside of a serverless function. But to start, I want to install my package, so I'm going to copy this npm install SendGrid Mail and paste it in my terminal to install that package. Where after you're done installing it, we'll also need to make sure we configure our environment variable for our SendGrid API. So I'm going to create a new file, call it .env.local, and we're going to create a new environment variable called SendGrid API key, which we're going to set that equal to our key that we'll get from our account. Now, one thing you want to make sure you do is check inside git ignore to make sure that the .env file is in there, which mine is, but if yours isn't, make sure to add it so that you don't accidentally commit your secret key to your GitHub repository. Now, over in SendGrid, I want to make sure I head over to settings and then API keys where I'll actually get that key. So I'm going to create a new API key, where I'm going to call this my contact form Codux, where I can give it full access, but I only need to send mail. So I'm going to click restricted access, where I'm going to scroll down until I find mail send. I'm going to open that up, and I'm just going to make sure I give access to the mail send capability, and then finally click create and view. Now, don't bother trying to copy this down as I'm going to immediately delete it, but I'm going to now copy this key, and keep in mind, they're not going to ever show you this key again, but I'm going to copy this key so that we can actually use it, paste it into that environment variable value, where now if you didn't restart your development server, make sure you restart it now so that it picks up that environment variable. But now I want to actually start to use that API key and the SDK in order to send mail when I click submit. So back inside of my mail.tsx file, I'm going to say constant mail is equal to require at SendGrid/mail, which is the package we installed. And then I'm going to run mail.set API key and pass in process.env.SendGrid API key, which will pull that value that we set in .env.local. Next, I want to actually create the message that I'm going to send using the body. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new constant called message, and I'm going to set that equal to template literals, which this is going to allow me to just format it a little bit easier for me to read, where I'm going to have my name, the email, and ultimately the message that the person sent. And we can grab this all from the body. So I'm going to say that I want the body.name, I want the body.email, and the body.message. Now, the only trick here is if we just leave this as is, it's just going to give it as one string. It's going to ignore that white space. So we need to make sure we do something to actually avoid that. So what I'm going to do is at the end of each of these, I'm going to put the characters of RN, which is going to just give me an ability to make sure that we create these to skip down to a second line. Ultimately, this is going to tell our text version that we want to create a new return from the actual message when this is coming through. So I'm going to actually copy and paste that into each of the lines. Probably don't necessarily need it on the last one, but I'll put it anyways. But now we're going to use mail.send, where I'm going to pass in a new object, and I'm going to include two from the subject, the text version of the email and the HTML version of the email. Now the two, that's going to be wherever you want to send this, such as how about hello@colbyfayok.com, which I'll probably change that to my personal email address for when I'm testing this. Now the from is going to be importantly the actual address that you have set up inside of SendGrid. Now I set up hello@colbyfayok.com or the colbyfayok domain in order to work, so I'm going to actually use that there. And another tip, if you want, you can use environment variables for this to avoid actually committing email address to your repository if you probably don't want those included in spam and just generally parse inside of your GitHub repository. But then we can create our message, and I'm going to say new mail from, and I can create body.name so it can dynamically say who that mail's from. Now the text version of this message is going to be the message itself, but then for our HTML, we want to do that a little bit differently, where we're going to replace all these instances of RN with an actual HTML break statement. So I'm going to say message.replace, and I'm going to create a new little regex pattern that looks for that RN, but I want to run that globally. And I'm going to say whenever I run that, I want to ultimately replace it with a new line break. And then finally, I want to add an await to the beginning of this send statement since it is asynchronous in nature, but then we probably don't want to still return this body. So I'm just going to say success is true, and you can return whatever you want as the body of the actual serverless function. But now let's actually try to submit this and see what happens. Before I move on, it looks like I made a typo in both the require statement and the API key where I missed the D. So that's going to be SendGrid. But now when I submit the form, you should now see a new email come through if you have it all properly configured, where now I can see new mail from Colby Fayok and it has my name, email, my message, everything that I sent through the body of that email. And while this was a simple email, we can customize this to exactly how we want. And we can use both our text and HTML versions to do so. Now, the reason that's important to send both text and HTML is because not all clients actually accept HTML, or maybe just the person receiving it has HTML turned off because they prefer text. So it's important to make sure you're configuring both. And since we're just sending such a very simple email with this information, this is just an easy way for us to do that. But now we can see we have our full functional contact form that we were able to wire up using Netlify Functions and actually send mail with SendGrid. But we were able to fully visually edit all aspects of this, including building all of our components and styling everything to look exactly how we want inside of our application. As a developer who likes to design, I'm either constantly going back and forth between my browser and my editor, or I'm actually designing in the browser using the actual developer tools. And this bridges that gap, giving me the ability to visually edit everything inside of my project. While Codux is free, it's still currently in beta, but where do you see it fitting into your workflow? Let me know in the comments. If you want to learn how to add more interaction in your React application, including adding a long press gesture, check out my video detecting long press gestures with JavaScript events in React. Or if you want to learn how to trigger something when something comes into view, such as triggering an animation, check out my video, Trigger a Function when Scrolling to an Element in React with Intersection Observer. Thanks so much to Codux for sponsoring this video, and if you like this video, make sure you hit thumbs up, subscribe, and click that little notification bell for more web dev content. Thanks for watching.